The record was not discovered with ceremony or intention. There was no announcement, no historian standing before cameras, no museum unveiling. It was found by accident, the way uncomfortable truths often are. In the basement of a county courthouse scheduled for demolition, a clerk sorting through decayed boxes noticed a ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. It was heavier than it looked, swollen with moisture and age. Most of the writing inside had blurred with time, but enough remained to tell a story that had waited more than a century to be seen. The ledger was not labeled with names or places on the cover. Only a number had been carved into the leather, pressed deep as if someone wanted it to survive fire or flood. Inside were columns drawn with a ruler, each line carefully measured. This was not a diary. It was not personal. It was administrative. That was what made it more frightening. Pain written casually is often more honest than pain described with emotion. At first glance, the entries appeared ordinary by the standards of the era. Plantation names, dates, property transfers, inventory, livestock, tools, human beings listed between cattle and cotton bales. Men, women, children reduced to measurements of age, strength, and reproductive status. The language was precise, cold, and consistent. But as the pages were turned, one detail began to repeat itself with disturbing regularity. A woman's name appeared again and again. Sometimes the spelling changed slightly. Sometimes a letter was missing. Sometimes her age was adjusted, as if the writer could not be bothered to count carefully. But the core remained the same woman, the same identifying marks, the same note, written in the same careful hand, female slave, transferred after birth. One birth might not have raised suspicion. Two could be coincidence. But this record showed 5.5 births, 5 different plantations, 5 transfers, and nowhere in the ledger was there an explanation. In the world of plantations, movement was common. People were bought, sold, inherited, gambled away. Families were broken daily. But there was a rhythm to it. Pregnant women were valuable. Mothers were often kept near their children for at least some time, if only because infants required care. This woman was different. Each time she gave birth, she was removed almost immediately. No note of recovery. No record of nursing. Just relocation. The ledger did not record emotions. It did not record screams or blood or tears. But absence can speak as loudly as detail. And what was absent here was any acknowledgement that these were children born to a mother at all. The children were recorded separately, listed as property. Their mothers unnamed or marked unknown. In one case, the child was recorded in a different ledger entirely in a different county with no link back. The separation was not accidental. It was systematic. As historians began to study the ledger, they noticed something else. The dates of the births coincided with periods when powerful men were present on each plantation. Owners, overseers, visiting relatives from prominent families. Men whose names appeared elsewhere in the historical record as respectable figures. Donors to churches, signers of land deeds, sponsors of schools. The ledger never accused anyone. It did not need to. It simply recorded outcomes. This woman's life, when reconstructed from fragments, did not resemble survival. It resembled endurance under a plan she did not design and could not escape. No one recorded where she was born. There was no purchase record for her initial arrival. No ship manifest. No bill of sale. She entered history already enslaved, already silent. People remembered arrivals vividly when chains were new and wounds were fresh. They remembered the screams of mothers losing children at auction blocks. They remembered names shouted in languages the buyers did not understand. But no one remembered her arrival. It was as if she had always been there. On the first plantation listed in the ledger, she appeared in a labor inventory with no prior reference. Her age was estimated. Her skills were listed simply as field and domestic. No family connections were noted. That absence mattered. Enslaved people clung to kinship records, even informal ones. They whispered lineages at night. They remembered who belonged to whom. But for her, there were no such links. The women on the plantation noticed her quietness. Silence was common among the enslaved, but hers was different. She did not whisper at night. She did not sing while working. She did not cry openly. When spoken to, she answered briefly and lowered her eyes. When ignored, she seemed to shrink further into herself, as if hoping to disappear into the background. When she became pregnant the first time, there was no celebration, no mourning, no comment. Pregnancy was expected. It was part of the system. But some pregnancies were talked about. Some were joked about cruelly. Some were whispered about with fear. Hers was met with nothing at all. She worked until she could no longer bend. She gave birth in a cramped cabin with other enslaved women assisting her, as they always did. There was no doctor. There was no comfort. Childbirth for enslaved women was a dangerous ordeal, made worse by exhaustion and malnutrition. Many did not survive it. She survived. The child lived. 2 days later, the overseer came with a wagon. There was no explanation given to the women watching from a distance. Orders were orders. The woman was told to stand. She was told to walk. She was not allowed to carry the child. Another woman was assigned to that task, briefly, until the child was taken inside the main house. The wagon left before sunrise. No one said goodbye. On the second plantation, her name appeared again months later, entered neatly into a new ledger. Her age was adjusted upward. Her body was marked as recovering. No mention was made of a child. She was assigned to domestic work this time inside the house. Those who worked in plantation houses saw things field workers did not. They heard conversations. They learned patterns of behavior. They noticed how certain men behaved differently when doors were closed. When she became pregnant again, the house servants noticed the tension change. Voices lowered. Orders became sharper. She was watched more closely. And once again, when the child was born, she was removed almost immediately. The pattern repeated. By the third plantation, people began to notice that her children did not resemble the others. The babies were lighter. Their features were different. This was not unheard of, but it was dangerous. Children who visibly reflected the violence of the system threatened the image plantation owners worked hard to maintain. Those children were evidence. Evidence had to be controlled. The solution was separation. Move the mother. Scatter the children. Destroy the visible link. The woman herself never protested publicly. That does not mean she did not suffer. Silence was often the only form of resistance available. To scream was to invite punishment. To fight was to risk death. To go quiet was sometimes the only way to survive. With each transfer, she aged faster. Trauma does that. Her posture changed. Her movements slowed. People described her as walking carefully, as if conserving strength. Her eyes avoided faces. But sometimes, when she thought she was alone, witnesses remembered seeing her stare at nothing for long periods, as if replaying memories she could not afford to share. The ledger does not describe her emotions. It only tracks outcomes. Birth, transfer, birth, transfer. By the time of her fourth pregnancy, her body was no longer young. The ledger noted health declining. Yet still, she was kept alive. That alone suggests intent. Many enslaved people with declining health were sold cheaply or left to die. She was not. She was moved again. The fifth birth occurred 17 years after the first. 17 years of repeated loss. 17 years of being denied the most basic human bond. The ledger recorded the birth, the child's sex, and then, for the last time, the familiar phrase, transferred. After that, the woman vanished from the records entirely. No death entry, no sale, no burial note, just absence. Her children did not vanish as completely. They appear briefly in other records, stripped of maternal connection. One appears in a household inventory listed as boy, age 7, origin unknown. Another is sold north, renamed. One disappears after infancy, possibly dead, possibly absorbed into another ledger lost to time. This is how history hides crimes. Not with lies but with fragments. The ledger did not tell the full story. It was never meant to. It was meant to manage property, not preserve humanity. But in its precision, it accidentally preserved a pattern that could not be explained away. A woman moved 5 times after 5 births is not coincidence. It is policy, and policy always reflects power. This record forces us to confront a truth often softened in textbooks. Slavery was not just physical labor enforced by violence. It was reproductive control. It was the calculated use of women's bodies to satisfy power, then erase the consequences. The woman in the ledger had no voice in the record, but the repetition speaks for her. Each line is a wound. Each transfer is a severed bond. Each absence is a reminder that history often survives not because it is told honestly, but because it failed to hide itself completely. This was only the beginning. The ledger did not end her story. It opened it, and what it revealed would only grow darker. On the plantations where she was sent, people tried to place her within the quiet social map that enslaved communities created for themselves. They asked silently where she fit, who her people were, who had raised her. Every enslaved person carried fragments of lineage, even if broken. Someone remembered a mother's name, a grandmother's accent, a place whispered about at night. These fragments were fragile, but they mattered. They were proof that life existed before ownership. With this woman there was nothing. No stories followed her. No one ever came looking for her. No one whispered her name with recognition. She arrived alone every time, already detached from any known past. That absence unsettled the others more than open suffering would have. A person with no remembered origin felt dangerous in a system that thrived on classification. Plantation owners liked order. Overseers liked predictability. Even the enslaved learned to survive by knowing who belonged where. She belonged nowhere. She moved through the space like a shadow, present but never fully seen. On each plantation, she was given a new name. Sometimes it was a shortened version of the previous one. Sometimes it was entirely different. The renaming was casual, almost careless, but it was another form of erasure. Names were anchors. To change a name was to loosen a person's grip on themselves. She accepted each new name without protest. She responded when called. She never corrected anyone. Over time, it became impossible to know which name had ever truly been hers. Her silence was not ignorance. People who worked beside her noticed that she understood everything. Instructions, warnings, unspoken rules. She learned routines quickly. She avoided punishment not by luck, but by careful observation. Silence was her shield. It allowed her to pass through days without drawing attention. Women on the plantations watched her closely during her pregnancies. Pregnancy among enslaved women was complicated. It brought fear, exhaustion, and sometimes a strange sense of pride, because children could be sources of comfort even in bondage. But pregnancy also brought vulnerability. Overseers were harsher. Bodies were scrutinized. Expectations did not ease simply because a woman was carrying life. She worked until she physically could not. There were no allowances made for her condition. When her movements slowed, she was threatened. When she faltered, she was punished. Her body bore marks that were never recorded, injuries that healed poorly, scars layered upon scars. Still, she endured. During childbirth, she did not scream as others did. This was noted by the women assisting her. Pain without sound was rare. It frightened them. It felt unnatural, as if something inside her had already been broken beyond repair. When the child emerged, she did not cry out in joy either. She simply stared. Some interpreted this as coldness. Others sensed something else, a kind of restrained grief, as if she already knew what would come next. They were right. Each time, the child was taken from her quickly. There was no ritual, no explanation. The separation was abrupt, efficient, and final. No one ever told her where the child was going. No one ever told her why. Orders came from above, passed down without justification. After the first removal, people expected her to collapse. Many women did. The loss of a child could hollow a person out completely. Some never recovered. Some turned their pain outward. Some turned it inward. She did neither. She absorbed it. Absorption does not mean absence of pain. It means pain redirected inward, compressed, carried quietly. On the second plantation, she was assigned to work inside the main house. This change was significant. Housework was dangerous in different ways. The violence there was quieter, more hidden, wrapped in authority and entitlement. She cleaned floors, washed linens, carried trays, stood silently along walls while conversations flowed around her as if she were furniture. She heard things. She learned which men drank too much, which ones lingered, which ones called for her specifically. She learned when to lower her eyes and when to look away entirely. Survival required constant calculation. Her second pregnancy was not a mystery to those paying attention. The timing aligned too closely with the presence of a particular man, one who was spoken of with respect in public and fear in private. No one said his name aloud in connection with her condition. Silence was safer. When the child was born, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Voices tightened. Decisions were made behind closed doors. She was moved again, faster this time. The child did not remain in the house long enough to be seen by visitors. The potential evidence was removed. By the third plantation, her reputation preceded her in subtle ways. Overseers were instructed to keep her under control. Masters were warned vaguely that she required special handling. No one explained what that meant. They did not need to. Control was always the goal. Her body was no longer just labor. It was a problem to be managed. The women who worked with her noticed how she avoided looking at newborns after that. When other women gave birth, she did not come close. She did not offer comfort. She did not hold babies. This was not cruelty. It was protection. To attach was to risk unbearable pain. Still, her own pregnancies continued. Each time, whispers grew louder. The children's appearances fed rumors no one dared confirm. Lighter skin, hair that did not curl tightly, features that echoed faces seen in portraits on walls. These details were dangerous. They challenged the false purity that plantation families projected. They threatened to expose what everyone knew but pretended not to see. History often portrays enslaved women as passive victims. That image is incomplete. Survival required intelligence, restraint, and constant adaptation. Her silence was not weakness. It was strategy. She learned that speaking changed nothing. It only increased suffering. Silence at least allowed her to remain alive. But survival came at a cost. By the fourth pregnancy, her body showed signs of collapse. She moved stiffly. She tired quickly. Her eyes lost focus at times. People described her as looking through them rather than at them. Trauma does that. Pulls the mind inward, away from the present. The ledger notes declining health, but does not alter her treatment. She was still transferred, still expected to work, still used. Her usefulness had not ended. What makes her story particularly haunting is not just what was done to her, but how efficiently it was done. No chaos, no mistakes. Each birth followed by removal. Each removal recorded. Each child separated from its origin. This was not random cruelty. It was a system functioning as intended. The absence of protest in the record does not indicate consent. Enslaved people rarely had their resistance recorded. Resistance was punished, not documented. What survives in records is compliance because compliance was useful to those in power. Her final pregnancy occurred when she was no longer young by plantation standards. Many women did not survive repeated childbirth under such conditions. She did. That fact alone suggests she was kept alive deliberately. Her body was still serving a purpose. After the fifth birth, something changed. She was not transferred again in the usual way. There was no neat entry marking her relocation. Instead, the ledger simply stops mentioning her. The pattern breaks abruptly. Historians debate what this means. Death is possible. Sale under a different name is possible. Being left to die without record is also possible. But the children continue to appear, briefly, distantly, stripped of connection. This selective disappearance is telling. The system no longer needed her. The evidence had been scattered. The risk managed. Her life, reduced to lines on a page, exposes a deeper truth. Enslaved women were not just workers. They were instruments within a reproductive economy. Their bodies were sites of control, exploitation, and concealment. To understand slavery fully, one must understand women like her. Not because her suffering was unique, but because it was common enough to require systems of management and erasure. Her story challenges comforting myths. It reminds us that violence does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, records, transfers, and moves on. And yet, despite everything done to erase her, she remains. Not as a name we can speak with certainty, not as a face we can recognize, but as a pattern that refuses to disappear. The ledger did not save her life, but it saved the truth of what was done to it. And that truth will only become harder to ignore. By the time the pattern became undeniable, it had already been perfected. 5 births did not happen by accident. They did not occur in isolation. They followed a rhythm shaped by power, entitlement, and fear. The ledger did not record motives, but motives did not need to be written down. They lived in the structure of the plantation system itself. Enslaved women's bodies were never their own. They were controlled, accessed, and discarded according to the needs and desires of men whose authority was absolute. The first birth may have been treated as routine. A woman gave birth, and life on the plantation continued. But even then, decisions were being made quietly. The child's appearance would have been noticed immediately. Plantation households were intimate spaces where nothing escaped attention for long. Skin tone, hair texture, facial features, these details were observed, compared, and measured against the faces of those who held power. White men who raped enslaved women often relied on silence to protect them. Silence from the law. Silence from their families. Silence enforced by fear. But children complicated that silence. Children were living reminders. They could grow. They could resemble. They could provoke questions that no one wanted asked. The solution was not mercy. It was management. After the first birth, the woman was moved. This solved several problems at once. It removed her from the site of the crime. It severed the maternal bond before it could deepen. It allowed the child to be reclassified, absorbed into the system without context. If questions arose later, the answers would already be gone. On the second plantation, the same conditions repeated themselves. Powerful man. Access without consequence. A pregnancy that no one officially acknowledged. This time, the response was faster. Experience had taught them efficiency. There was no waiting period. No delay. The woman was transferred as soon as the child could survive without her body. This pattern reveals something critical. These were not impulsive acts by unrelated men. They were acts supported by a culture that protected them. Plantation owners, overseers, and elite families understood one another's vulnerabilities. They shared interests. They shared silence. Records from the time show how carefully reputations were maintained. Letters spoke of honor, legacy, and family name. Churches were built. Donations were made. Public morality was performed loudly. Meanwhile, private violence was hidden in plain sight. The woman's third pregnancy coincided with a visit from a relative of the plantation owner. This man did not live there permanently. He was a guest. That detail matters. Guests were shielded from consequences even more aggressively. Any scandal attached to them would ripple outward into other powerful families. The child born from that pregnancy was noted in a separate ledger entirely, one that catalogued enslaved children under the age of 5. The mother was not listed. The child was described only in terms of health and future labor potential. Within weeks, the woman was gone again. By the fourth birth, the system was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. Her movements were monitored. Her work assignments were chosen carefully. She was kept within reach of the men who wanted access and away from those who might ask questions. It is important to understand that enslaved women could not refuse. Resistance meant punishment. Punishment could mean death. Even pregnancy did not protect them. In many cases, it made them more vulnerable. The violence was normalized. It was woven into daily life. Enslaved women learned early that their suffering would not be acknowledged. The law did not recognize rape when the victim was property. The courts did not intervene. Even other enslaved people often avoided speaking openly, because proximity to scandal could bring danger. The fifth birth occurred after years of repetition. By then, the woman's body had endured more than it should have survived. Each pregnancy weakened her. Each forced separation tore something from her that could not heal. And yet, she lived long enough to give birth again. This raises an uncomfortable question. Why was she kept alive? Historians suggest several possibilities. One is that her body was considered unusually resilient. Another is that she was deliberately preserved because of her ability to produce children who could be manipulated, sold, or hidden. A darker possibility is that she was kept alive because killing her would have raised questions. A disappearance after repeated transfers might have drawn attention. Silence worked best when nothing appeared out of place. After the fifth birth, the pattern ends abruptly. The ledger records the child. It records the transfer. And then it stops recording the woman altogether. This sudden absence is significant. It suggests a decision point. Something changed. Perhaps her body finally failed. Perhaps she was sold under a new name. Perhaps she was left to die without record. All of these were common outcomes. What is uncommon is the clean break in documentation. The system no longer needed to track her. Her purpose, whatever it had been, was complete. The children, however, continued to exist within the system. Their lives unfolded quietly, stripped of origin. They were moved, sold, trained, renamed. Any resemblance they bore to white men would be dismissed or explained away. Over time, memory would fade. Features would blend. Evidence would disappear. This is how systems protect themselves. Not through grand conspiracies, but through consistent small actions repeated over time. Each man involved could tell himself that he was not responsible for the whole. He only played his part. The system took care of the rest. The ledger is devastating because it reveals that coordination without ever stating it. No one wrote, "We must hide this." They did not need to. Everyone understood what was at stake. Reputation, inheritance, power. The woman at the center of this story was never granted even the dignity of being acknowledged as a victim. She was treated as a logistical issue, a body that required relocation, problem to be solved. Yet her repeated appearance across 5 plantations exposes something that history often avoids. Slavery was sustained not just by violence but by bureaucracy. Ledgers, transfers, inventories, cold ink on paper. This is why the record matters. It strips away romanticized narratives and forces confrontation with reality. The violence was organized. The suffering was predictable. The erasure was intentional. Her life did not intersect with these men by chance. It was shaped by their power, and their power depended on her silence. But silence does not mean consent. Silence does not mean absence of pain. Silence, in this case, was survival under conditions that allowed no other option. When we read the ledger now, we hear what was never meant to be heard. The quiet accumulation of cruelty, the repetition of loss, the system working exactly as designed. 5 births, 5 secrets. One woman erased so many men could remain untouched. And yet, despite every effort to scatter the truth, the pattern survived. Because paper remembers what people try to forget. By the time the woman reached the last years of her recorded life, she no longer resembled the person who had first appeared in the ledger. The transformation was not dramatic in a way that would have drawn attention. It was quiet, gradual, and devastating. Her body had become smaller, her movements slower, her presence easier to overlook. This, too, was part of survival. To take up less space was to invite less notice. And less notice meant fewer punishments, fewer hands, fewer commands spoken with expectation. Plantations were places where people learned to read decline without ever naming it. Enslaved communities understood when someone was nearing the end of their usefulness in the eyes of the system. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. Work assignments became lighter not out of kindness, but out of calculation. A person was shifted to tasks that required less strength, not because their suffering mattered, but because their remaining energy was being rationed. This woman reached that stage slowly, unevenly, stretched across years of exhaustion. Her body carried the weight of repeated childbirth without recovery. Each pregnancy had taken something from her that was never returned. Nutrition was poor. Rest was rare. Medical care was almost non-existent. Pain was endured, not treated. In such conditions, survival itself became an act of endurance beyond what most bodies could manage. And yet, she remained alive long enough to fulfill what the system required of her. Those around her noticed that she had stopped speaking almost entirely, not just in public, but even in the quiet moments shared among enslaved women at night. She did not participate in whispered conversations. She did not trade memories or warnings. She did not ask questions. It was as if she had learned that language itself was dangerous. Words could betray thoughts. Silence, at least, could be controlled. This withdrawal was not a sign of emptiness. It was a sign of overload. Trauma, repeated without relief, often leads people inward. The mind creates distance where the body cannot. Her stillness was not absence. It was containment. On the plantation where she spent what appeared to be her final recorded years, she was assigned work that kept her away from the main house. This was a change. Earlier, she had been kept close, visible to those who sought control. Now, she was placed on the margins. Gardens, storage rooms, laundry areas far from public view. The shift suggests that her value had changed. She was no longer being managed as a risk. She was being managed as a remainder. The ledger entries during this period are sparse. Her name appears less frequently. When it does, it is accompanied by vague notes. Condition weakened. Output reduced. No longer suitable for heavy labor. These were not observations made with concern. They were assessments of diminishing returns. This is the moment where erasure becomes complete. Once a person was no longer useful, the system had no incentive to remember them. Death did not require documentation unless it affected property transfer. Illness did not matter unless it spread. Suffering was irrelevant unless it interrupted production. Many enslaved people died without ever being formally recorded. Their absence was absorbed into routine. The woman at the center of this story was already halfway erased long before her physical disappearance. Her name had changed too many times. Her children had been separated and scattered. No kin remained to speak for her. No one had the power to insist on her being seen. This is how complete erasure works. It does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. There is no record of her burial. No notation of illness severe enough to cause death. No sale recorded under her known identifiers. This suggests a death that was inconvenient to acknowledge. Perhaps she died during labor after the fifth birth. Perhaps she died from infection, exhaustion, or injury. Perhaps she lived just long enough to be deemed worthless and then was left to die quietly. In plantation culture, death without ceremony was common for the enslaved. Graves were shallow. Markers were rare. Names were not carved into stone. Memory was expected to fade quickly. The land absorbed bodies the way it absorbed sweat and blood, without record. What remains disturbing is not just that she disappeared, but that her disappearance fit so neatly into the system. No investigation followed. No gap disrupted operations. No one was held accountable. This was not negligence. It was design. The children she bore lived on within the system, but not as her children. Their identities were deliberately severed from her existence. They were renamed, reclassified, reassigned. Any resemblance they bore to white men was something they learned not to question. Questions could be dangerous. Silence was inherited. Some of these children may have grown up sensing that something about their lives did not add up. Perhaps they noticed how they were treated differently. Perhaps they were assigned to indoor work more often. Perhaps they were kept close to the house or trained for roles that required trust. These decisions were rarely explained. They did not need to be. The system knew what it was doing. Others may have been sold far away, sent north or west, their histories wiped clean by distance. In new places, no one would know where they came from. No one would connect them to the woman who had given birth to them under such controlled circumstances. This scattering was the final act of erasure. A person can be forgotten, but a pattern is harder to erase. The system understood this. That is why it broke the pattern into pieces. One child here, one child there. No single place held the whole truth. But the cost of erasure is never confined to the erased. It spreads outward. The women who watched her lose child after child learned a terrible lesson. Attachment was dangerous. Hope was dangerous. Love could be used against you. Many hardened themselves in response. Others broke quietly. Trauma reshaped the community, even when no one spoke of it. The men who benefited from her suffering paid a different cost. They lived with secrets that could never be fully buried. They relied on silence not just from others, but from themselves. Publicly, they presented morality. Privately, they knew what had been done. That knowledge does not vanish simply because it is hidden. Corrodes. Yet history has often been kinder to them than to her. Their names appear in records as landowners, donors, leaders. Their portraits hang in restored homes. Their descendants may know little or nothing about the violence that sustained their legacy. The system succeeded in protecting them. Until the ledger surfaced. The ledger does not accuse directly. It does not name perpetrators. But it removes the comfort of denial. It reveals coordination. It reveals repetition. It reveals intent. And once intent is visible, innocence collapses. The woman's life forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Slavery was not only maintained through brute force. It was maintained through administration, through careful record-keeping, through decisions made quietly by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Her erasure was not a failure of the system. It was one of its functions. And yet, despite all this, she endures in a way her oppressors did not anticipate. She endures because patterns tell stories even when names are lost. She endures because silence, once documented, becomes testimony. The cost of erasure is that it never fully works. Something always remains. A ledger, pattern, a question that refuses to stay buried. Her life did not end with dignity. It likely ended in pain, exhaustion, and neglect. But her story did not end there. It waited. It waited in a basement, in fading ink, in lines written without compassion. It waited for someone to look closely enough to notice that one woman had been moved too many times, at exactly the wrong moments, for coincidence to explain. And once noticed, it could not be unseen. This is the cost the system did not calculate. That eventually, even silence leaves traces. That even erasure produces evidence. That even the most carefully hidden violence can surface, long after the people responsible are gone. The woman's final years were meant to disappear without impact. Instead, they became the key to understanding the machinery that destroyed her. And that machinery does not belong only to the past. The ledger does not end with a confession. It does not close with remorse, apology, or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It simply stops. The final page curls inward at the edges, ink fading into the color of the paper itself. This ending is not dramatic. It is administrative, and that is precisely what makes it honest. Systems of cruelty rarely announce themselves. They do not feel the need to explain. They assume permanence. They assume they will never be questioned. For generations, this assumption held. Plantations became historical sites. Houses were restored. Tour guides spoke of architecture, economics, and elegance. Slavery was mentioned, but often briefly, abstractly, softened by distance. Enslaved people became numbers, labor forces, unnamed masses. Women like the one in the ledger were rarely discussed at all. Their experiences did not fit easily into narratives of progress or reconciliation. Sexual violence was especially avoided. Complicated everything. It challenged myths of benevolent masters. It exposed intimacy between power and brutality. It made the past feel uncomfortably close. So silence continued. But silence does not erase consequences. It only delays recognition. The woman whose life appears in fragments across 5 plantations did not live to see her story acknowledged. She did not receive justice. She did not receive remembrance. But history is not only shaped by those who speak. It is also shaped by what survives despite efforts to destroy it. The ledger survived because someone believed it mattered to keep records. They did not intend to preserve truth. They intended to preserve order. Ironically, that commitment to documentation became the system's undoing. Modern historians approach records like this carefully. They know that ledgers reflect the perspective of power. They know what is included and what is excluded is deliberate. But they also know that patterns reveal what words avoid. 5 births, 5 transfers, 5 different plantations. This repetition is not random. It is the fingerprint of intention. When scholars cross-referenced the ledger with other surviving documents, more connections emerged. Names of plantation owners appeared in correspondence elsewhere. Travel records showed visits that aligned with pregnancies. Financial documents revealed payments and transfers that coincided with the woman's movements. None of these pieces alone proved anything. Together, they formed a narrative that could no longer be dismissed. This is how historical truth often emerges. Not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. Through patience. Through refusal to accept convenient explanations. The woman's story forces us to confront slavery not as an abstract evil, but as a lived system with daily decisions made by ordinary people who benefited from extraordinary cruelty. It reminds us that violence does not require monsters. It requires permission. It requires protection. It requires silence. Her children, scattered and renamed, likely carried her legacy without knowing it. Some may have survived into emancipation. Some may have lived long enough to see freedom declared in words, if not fully realized in practice. They may have carried physical features that sparked questions they were taught not to ask. They may have sensed absences in their histories without knowing why. Descendants today may exist who do not know their lineage includes both enslaved women and enslavers. This is one of slavery's most enduring legacies. Bloodlines crossed under violence, then hidden. Families built on foundations that were never acknowledged. Silence passed down not only through records, but through generations. When modern audiences encounter stories like this, discomfort often follows. There is a temptation to distance oneself, to say, "This was long ago," or "This was normal for the time." But normalization does not equal justification. Widespread cruelty does not become less cruel because it was common. The ledger strips away excuses. It shows planning. It shows repetition. It shows how systems adapt to protect those at the top while consuming those at the bottom. Importantly, the woman in this story was not unique. She represents countless others whose experiences were never recorded so clearly. For every ledger that survives, there are hundreds that were destroyed, lost, or never created. For every woman whose pattern can be reconstructed, there are many whose suffering left no trace at all. This knowledge carries responsibility. Remembering is not passive. It requires effort. It requires willingness to sit with discomfort. It requires rejecting simplified versions of the past that allow us to feel detached or innocent. The woman's silence during her life does not obligate us to silence now. On the contrary, it demands voice. It demands that we speak about the systems that made her suffering possible and profitable. This is not about assigning guilt to individuals long dead. It is about understanding structures that continue to shape inequality, power, and memory. When history hides certain stories, it shapes how societies understand themselves. It shapes whose pain is recognized and whose is ignored. The record reveals that enslaved women were not just victims of labor exploitation. They were targets of sexual violence that was organized, concealed, and normalized. Their reproductive lives were controlled not only for economic gain, but for the protection of reputations. Children born of violence were managed as problems, not people. These truths challenge comfortable narratives. That is why they were hidden. But once uncovered, they change how we must tell the story of the past. Museums that once focused on architecture now confront human cost. Educators who once glossed over sexual violence now must address it honestly. Descendants who once believed in clean family histories now face complexity. This is not destruction of history. It is completion. The ledger does not give the woman a name we can be certain of. It does not give us her voice, but it gives us something equally powerful. It gives us proof. Proof that what many suspected but could not demonstrate was real. Proof that violence was systemic, not incidental. Proof that erasure was deliberate. In telling her story, we do not claim to speak for her. We acknowledge that she was denied the chance to speak for herself. We acknowledge that her humanity was reduced to ink and columns. And we refuse to let that be the final word. Her life mattered, even if the system treated it as expendable. Her suffering mattered, even if it was never acknowledged. Her children mattered, even if they were scattered. History often celebrates survival. But survival is not the only measure of significance. Endurance under injustice, even when it ends in erasure, still carries meaning, especially when that erasure is exposed. The ledger was never meant to be found. It was never meant to be read this way. It was meant to disappear quietly, taking its secrets with it. That it failed is not an accident. It is a reminder that truth has a way of surviving even the most careful attempts to destroy it. When we read the final line and close the book, the story does not end. It continues in questions we ask, in narratives we challenge, in histories we choose to tell fully rather than conveniently. The woman's story is not just about the past. It is about how we handle knowledge today. Whether we turn away when history becomes uncomfortable, or whether we stay, listen, and allow it to change how we understand the world we inherited. She was moved so no one would ever see the whole of her life. Ironically, those movements created the trail that revealed everything. And now, the truth stands where silence once lived.